I wanted to introduce simply with a title, Simply Being Good-Hearted is Not Enough, a Spirituality of Charity, Justice, and Prophecy. I want to begin with just a few quotes from famous justice theologians. Gustavo Gutierrez, whom we gave a doctorate to, an honorary doctorate to 2 years ago, he says, remember the famous line from Athanasius, he says, the glory of God is the human being fully alive. And Gutierrez says, the glory of God is the poor person fully alive. He also, when he was here, right on the stage, somebody asked him, they said, who are the poor? And Gutierrez says, the poor are those who don't have a right to have rights. And we know who they are. Jim Wallace, and I'll be quoting some of these people through the weeks, he says, any preaching that is not good news for the poor is not the gospel of Jesus Christ. And you don't have to believe him, you just have to read the gospel. Remember, Jesus gives his mission statement. He said, I've come to bring good news to the poor. So any of our preaching, if it's not good news to the poor, it's not the gospel of Jesus. And then Daniel Berrigan, whom I'll talk about at length in the last week, he says, peace will not be won without the moral equivalent of the loss and suffering and separation that war itself is exacting. You know, we wage war, and it costs, it's a terrible cost in terms of lives and money and efforts and lost dreams. He says, waging peace costs just as much. You know, we're not going to have peace in the world if we don't put the same kind of, he said, the moral equivalent of the loss that is caused by war. Now, just to set up the 3 weeks, we want to do it this way. This week I want to talk about simply charity and justice and the place of both inside of Christian spirituality. Next week I want to talk more about some key principles within social justice. Then the third week we'll talk more about being prophets for justice. A little bit of an outline of where we're going tonight. I want to talk a little bit about what is social justice, but especially the distinction between charity and justice, then major social justice issues, and then I want to name and just show you the key figures and authors who are writing today. And then very importantly, I want to show you the place of both social justice and charity within Christianity, Christian spirituality as a whole. And if there's time at the end, I'd like to look at, just take one issue and parse it. Just the whole issue, for instance, which is so divisive today, abortion as a social justice issue. Okay, so let's begin. I want to begin with a story. I didn't tell a joke at the beginning, so this is a joke, but with a bit of a purpose to it. Okay. But to tell a story of the United Way, they approached this man, who was a very rich man, and they approached him, and they said to him, he said, you know, we've done our research, and we found out that you have never given any money to charity. So the man said, well, I find this very interesting that you've done this kind of research. He said, now you may have researched further. He said, had you researched a little further, you would have also found out that when I was a child, my father died, leaving my mother with 5 children and no one to support her, and I'm the oldest son. You would have also found out that I have a brother who's completely physically and mentally handicapped, who needs very expensive institutional care all the time. You would also have found out that I have a brother who has 6 kids and he's unemployed, looking for help. He said, now, if I haven't given any money to them, why would I give some to you? Okay. Okay. I said it has a purpose. Okay. You see a little quote up there that's small, but I'll read it to you. It's from Jim Wallace, and from where I kind of stole his title. He said, it's not just what's in your heart that makes for justice, it's also what is at the heart of public policy. That's where you're going to see just being good-hearted, it's not enough. It's good, but it's not enough. So he said, it's not just what's in your heart. So if someone say, well, look, I have lots of black friends. Well, that doesn't necessarily protect black people on the streets, you know. Or I have lots of friends, you know, I work in a soup kitchen. That's good, but what's at the heart of our policy? Okay, now, let's look at that. What is social justice? And this story isn't my own. This is the stock story on social justice, but it's a good one. It truly illustrates the difference between charity and justice, both of which are called for by Jesus, okay? And the story is this. To tell a story of a town, and the town was down a river, and there was a big bend in the river. They couldn't see up the river. And one day some kids were playing by the river, and they found 5 bodies were floating down the river. So they called some adults, and the adults quickly pulled these bodies out. 2 were dead, and they buried them. 1 was a child. They found a foster home. 1 person was severely ill. They took the person to the hospital. They found a place to live for the 5th person. And then it happened that each day, some bodies would come down the river. And the townspeople, very charitable, and they'd always do what needed to be done. If they were kids, they would find them foster homes, put them into schools. If somebody was sick, they'd put them in a hospital. If somebody needed help, they'd find them help. And they did this for years. It just became part of the town's ethos that every day they'd go to the river and they'd pull the bodies out and they'd do what needed to be done. But nobody ever thought of going up the river and finding out why those bodies were coming down the river. See, charity, which is very important. Jesus mandates charity, as we'll see. Charity is very important, but charity handles the bodies. You know, so that we handle the poor, we give money to the poor, we have soup kitchens, we do things and so on. We set up, programs to help the poor. But that's only half of it. It's an important half, but it's only half of it. That's charity. Justice is the attempt to go up the river and say, why are there poor people? Why are there bodies in the river? Why can't some people make a living? Why are there people on welfare? Why is there racism in our culture? Why is there sexism? Why do those things happen? And how do they happen? See, social justice charity is about handling one-to-one charity. And it's very, very important. That's mandated by Jesus. But you'll see Jesus also mandates justice, and justice is about, what about the systems? The systems that cause this. And that's the distinction. And it's a very important distinction. Often in our minds and in our spirituality, we just blur this, And incidentally, we can be quite bipolar on this. We can be a person who's wonderfully charitable, but we're not looking at issues of justice, or vice versa. I know some people who are really committed to social justice, and they're not very good people at all. You don't want to be sitting beside them at a table, and so on. So, but you need them both. We need to be people who handle the bodies. And when somebody rings your doorbell and this is money for a soup kitchen or something, or right now, for instance, and it's heartening to watch on television just the incredible response there is to the tragedy of Harvey, and just people opening their wallets and opening their houses and so on. That's wonderful. That's gospel. That's charity. Now, of course, hurricanes aren't a systemic issue. Okay, that's all we can do. A lot of times, all you can do is charity. But see, we're called as Christians to work for justice, and justice is to work up the river. Why are there bodies? Sometimes I give a more simple metaphor where I say, I can be a good person, and I might give you the shirt off my back. But I also have to ask, why do I have a closet full of shirts, and some people don't have a shirt at all? See, that's a different question. I wrote that in an article recently. I got a vicious letter from a man. He says, I earned all my shirts, and they should earn theirs too. Clearly, probably a very charitable Christian man. But notice that he doesn't see justice like these people should earn their own living. I want to talk about that. What would help us all sometimes is to do a course, what they call a sociology of poverty. How poverty and how these systems work. And I remember as a young student, I was like 19, was at the University of Ottawa. And in this class on sociology of poverty, we were all poor kids. We were kids from farms and blue-collar places and so on. We grew up, we never had a nickel to rub together, and we never had school lunches, and we never had, free tuition and all this type of stuff. In those days in Canada, we didn't have Medicare. So we were poor kids. And we were telling our professor one day, he said, we resent these kids today. They're getting all these welfare checks, and they're getting this, and they're getting that, and they're getting your university paid for, and we have to earn this hard money. He said, we were poor kids. He had a great line. He said, none of you were ever poor kids. He said, you were rich kids who didn't have any money. Notice that's something different. He said, you were rich kids, you just didn't have any money. Poverty isn't about what you have in your wallet at a given time. You see the opposite. If you took a street person and he or she would win a lottery of $1 million, 6 months to a year later, they'd be back on the street. And conversely, if you took somebody like Donald Trump and took away all his money, in 3 years from now, he'd be a millionaire again. He'd have been a rich person who temporarily didn't have any money. The person on the street would be a poor person who temporarily had some money. I once read a great line from the feminist Gloria Steinem. And Gloria Steinem said her mother was pretty badly overweight. And she said, I have the genes. She said, so my whole life, she said, I've been struggling to keep my weight down. She said, I've always kept it down. I've exercised and starved myself. She said, but I always think of myself as a fat woman who's slim at the moment. Okay. See, when I grew up, I was a rich kid who was poor for the first years of my life. Who didn't have any money. I wasn't poor. Didn't have any money. Just something different. See, poverty isn't about, that's the ad which I like so much, what's in your wallet. Okay? Poverty isn't about what's in your wallet at a given moment. It's, how you're resourced, how you're connected. The same thing, for instance, as an oblate or any religious. We have a vow of poverty, But we can't really make ourselves poor. Once you're rich, you cannot make yourself poor. Why? So I'll give you an example, a man I'll talk about in a few minutes. We had a wonderful oblate called Larry Rosebow. And Larry Rosebow was shot to death in 2009 in Guatemala, fighting for the poor. But at one point, and Larry was a kid from St. Louis, Missouri, he went down to Recife, Brazil, and he lived for about 6 or 7 years on the streets with the poor people, didn't have a rectory, ate whatever they could scrounge up, and he just lived on the streets. Then what happened is he got hepatitis. So you know what we did? The Oblates flew him home, and we put him in a really good hospital where he got great medical attention. Then after he recovered, we took him to our mother house in France for 6 months to give him a sabbatical to recover from that. If he had been a Brazilian, he'd have died. See, I can go and divest myself of this, but I'm rich. If I get sick, the Oblates will fly me to a good hospital. Then after I'm finished, they'll give me a sabbatical for 6 months in southern France, to write a book. See, so even when we try to be poor, we can't be poor. And sometimes with the poor, even when they try, they can't because the system doesn't work for them. Okay. See, so charity responds to the immediate wound. Justice tries to uproot the cause of the wound. And that's why, as the title said, it's not good enough just individually to be good-hearted. It's not enough. Like Wallace said, it's not just what's in your heart. It's what's in the heart of public policy. And not just in the heart of policy. What's the history? What's our history? We don't start from the same place at all, And, there's not a level playing field in our world. There's not a level playing field in our country, And no offense to him, because he was a great man, but for instance, Ronald Reagan used to say, any poor boy can become president of this country, because I did it. He could, but he was never poor. He was a rich kid who didn't have any money when he grew up. Okay. There's a lot of poor kids cannot become president of this country. Poverty is something else. Now, so justice works for systemic change. What is systemic change, or what are systems? Okay. Major social issues have to do with, and I've picked these words carefully, poverty, terrorism, unjust economic systems, unjust wars, racism, abortion, sexism, the ecology, climate change, immigration, refugees, historical seizure of lands and cultures, human trafficking, access to health care and education, among others. Every one of these is a major justice issue. Let's just take the second one. We often don't think of terrorism, for instance, as a systemic issue. Like I can tease that out in one line. You know what happens right now? Every time we kill a terrorist, we produce 2 more. See, so just killing terrorists doesn't get any further ahead. So then the people get alienated and we produce more terrorists. The only way we're ever going to stop terrorism is by draining the swamps that produce them. You know, this is a horrible analogy, but you can spray billions and billions of mosquitoes and kill them. But if you don't drain the swamps where they're being produced, they just keep killing mosquitoes, you know. And thank goodness our public policies begin to realize that, for instance, the war on terrorism, we can't win it. We can't win it militarily. Now, we need to be involved militarily, but that war has to be won, the battle has to be won in big ways. People's hearts have to change and so on. So just to kill terrorists, if you're always producing more, notice there's a system that's working. It's bigger than an individual, than Jack who gets killed, and so on. Economic structures, unjust wages, racism. We'll look at abortion later on, sexism. These are long-standing historical situations that given the sociology, the politics, the history of all these things, you're always going to have them. I'll give you another analogy, taken from mental health. So imagine, let's take a woman, and she's in a small place, and she's in a really, really oppressive situation. Say a marriage that's bad, a community that's bad, and so on, and so on. And she has a nervous breakdown. They take her to a hospital, and then she gets really good help, and she gets really well. And finally, she's really good. She goes back home. You know what's going to happen? In a year, she's going to break down again. See, because it's the situation that's causing the breakdown. You know, that's what they say. The private is political, and the political is private. You know, we don't live in isolated worlds and so on. So when our professor said, you were all rich kids who didn't have any money, he was looking at our sociology. We were all immigrant kids who grew up in families who valued education, hard work, and so on. It was simply, as soon as you get access, you're going to access this. You know, I went to school with, a bunch of guys. Most of them didn't finish high school. Today, they're all millionaires because they know how to work. They got sheet metal companies and so on, or they own their own companies. They'd buy me and sell me with all my degrees. You know, they all grew up without money. They were never poor, you know. But when you see the sociology of ghettos and gangs and so on, it's very, very different. Not just any poor kid can be president of the United States. Kids who grew up without money can become president of the United States, but they're not poor. They're rich kids who don't have money. Okay, but see, all of these issues, they're systemic issues. That means it's the system, and to change them, you're always going to have them. We'll look at abortion afterwards. You know, for instance, until a lot of systemic things change in our culture, we'll always have abortion, whether there's laws or not. Because it's being driven by, not by liberal ideology or whatever, it's just simply being driven by first of all, the sexual ethos in our culture. It's being driven by the economy. It's being driven by a lot of other things, you know. And the individualized woman who finds herself pregnant with no support, she's just a victim inside of a system that, and we're always going to have them. You're going to have them by the thousands all the time in this system. You're going to have poor people, you know. You're going to have, when you look at police brutality and everything else, it's going to happen in our present system. It's going to happen, and that's why it keeps happening. You know, Jim Wallace, I'm going to talk about in a few minutes, just wrote a book in which he's really taken a lot of heat for writing this book. He's an evangelical from Washington who's probably as close to a Dorothy Day as our culture has produced, our churches, and so on. In fact, Wallace defines himself, he says, I'm an evangelical Christian convert to Roman Catholic social doctrine, okay? And he means that. But he just wrote a book and he says, Racism, America's Original Sin. See, at the beginning of our history as human beings, Adam and Eve committed an original sin, and it's plagued us ever since. And Wallace says, he's white, but he says, he said at the beginning of our history, we had slavery. We had slavery, and he says, it's our original sin, and we haven't ever fully extricated ourselves from that. Now he takes a lot of heat. A lot of people challenge that. I saw him give that talk in Los Angeles at the conference this year, and a lot of people really went after him, but I think he's right. See, you can't just erase history, because, it's there. We got to grow forward, and there's so much healing and so on. But he says slavery was Americans' original sin, and it was in our origins. And today we still have some of the fruits of that. And it's not that necessarily we're bad people. Same as we're children of Adam and Eve. We partly inherit their sin. We're children of a country that had slavery, and it just doesn't wash clean in 100 years. It might take 200 years for this to wash clean. That's at the origin. See, and it's a systemic thing. We're good people. We're caught in it. My youngest brother right now, who works for an oil company, he works for Exxon in Canada, called Imperial Oil there. And actually, he's got a job now that's been very good for him, because for years, he was in their head office and he was defending oil prices, But anyway, more recently, they've put him in a job where he has to negotiate with Indian chiefs about lands and oil rights and so on. And it's been a powerful conversion for him. He said, this is the way it goes. In fact, and he said, Exxon is offering these natives wonderful compensatory packages and so on. He said, but he'll go out to present this to a tribe. He said, he'll present it. He said, and when I'm finished, this will always be the response. He said, somebody will stand up and says, sir, he said, I've been polite up to now, but I've been holding my tongue, but let me say it honestly. He said, you know what you are? You're just the guilty white person who's here trying to assuage white guilt for all you've done to us. He said, one of them told, said, and you're a Catholic, he said, the two organizations I hate the most in the whole world are the Catholic Church and Exxon, and you work for both. And my brother said, I tell him, it's true. But we have to move forward, We can't just erase that history. It's true. We are guilty white people, and it's not our fault. You didn't do that. We didn't take the land from the natives, and you didn't bring slaves over here and so on. But that's our history. That's where we're standing. And see, so it's not, that's what I mean. It's not enough to be good-hearted to say, well, I wasn't a slave owner, and I didn't take land from natives and so on. But somebody did. And that's part of our history. And it's still there. And it's still reaping untold amount of poverty and anger and stuff in people's minds, My brother said, I always say, that's true. I'm a guilty white person. But now, let's see if we can move forward. He said, oftentimes that's a good start. They say, yeah, let's talk about, then somebody will say, it wasn't your fault, it wasn't my fault. But there was a fault, See, so you and I, it's not what we did, it's where we're standing in history. See, that's to do with systems. Now, one last little bullet point on this before we move further, and that is that all these issues are interconnected. Concern for one issue demands concern for all these issues. See, I'll give you an example. I don't want to pick on any one group, but for instance, oftentimes that's the criticism made of pro-life, and that is that it's a single issue. And see, if you're going to be pro-life, it's not enough just to be against abortion, because all these issues are intertwined. You see, abortion has to do with unjust economic structures and everything else, and so on. So that's what Cardinal Bernardine, and I think in a wonderful formulation where he talked about, you have to have the seamless garment. He called it the seamless garment. Like all these issues are one. We got to be just women and men across the board. We can't pick one of these, or climate change, or pick, the native thing, or human trafficking, or something. We might pick one that we get involved in and so on, but we have to have a heart for them all and realize it's all of one piece. See, we can't have a just society that's they're really just in one area and they're unjust in other areas. After a while, the society's not just. It's all of one piece. Now, let's look at some key figures here. And you're going to recognize a lot of these names, maybe not their faces and so on. And now again, as an apologia, you don't have to like these people. But all of them are major social justice figures, okay? Because these are people who weren't just... Now notice on there, I haven't got Mother Teresa on there. Mother Teresa was probably the epitome of charity that we've had in centuries. She was a saint. But see, Mother Teresa was never considered a social justice figure. Why? Because Mother Teresa handled bodies. Mother Teresa was this wonderful, charitable woman who she went to the river every day and got the bodies out and washed them and buried them and fed them and so on. Mother Teresa didn't ask a lot of justice questions. You know, one of the more famous lines so I put it up there, and sorry it's in such small script and so on, but Helder Cameron, the Latin American bishop, said, "When I give food to the poor, they call me a saint." He said, "When I ask why the poor have no food, they call me a communist." Okay, that was his famous line and so on. Actually, you know, you've probably heard the famous line that said, "Give a man a fish and he eats for a day. Teach a man how to fish." He said, "Then he sits in a boat all day and drinks beer." Okay, so I put a little twist on that one, okay. That's it. But you know that line, they say, "Give a man a fish, he eats for a day. Teach a man how to fish, then he can feed his family all the time." Except I said, you know, there's a Confederate version of that, and then he drinks beer in a boat all day. Okay. Now, name some. You'll recognize his name, Oscar Romero, the famous bishop who got shot to death in El Salvador, and who's now being canonized. And it was interesting, some quick stories on some of these. Oscar Romero was an intellectual, a university professor. And at the time, there was a lot of tension there between the government, liberation theology, and Rome picked him because they decided he's not going to raise any, he's going to be safe. We're going to get this safe intellectuals, because intellectuals, we are safe. We're useless. We teach, but we're otherwise useless. You know. Like Robert Moore said, when the last tree has been cut down, the intellectuals have written a lot of studies about that and so on. So they picked him because he was safe. But then he was baptized by the poor. If you see his story, more and more as he saw the injustice of the government to the poor, he began to stand up to the government. And it ends at one point where he tells the president, he said, "You're a liar, and I'm calling you on it, and you're going to kill me, but I'm calling you a liar." And he had him killed, you know. But he stood up strongly for the poor. He said, "The system is unjust," you know. And it's interesting, some of the people running the system were very, very good Catholic people who went to Mass every Sunday, who came to him and wanted him to baptize their kids. So it wasn't like you had these vicious people, but there were people who were strongly entrenched in their wealth and in a system that gave them this wealth, but the system which was keeping the poor down. You know, it's interesting, his name slips my mind now, was the former Jesuit superior general, you know, Arupe, you know. He was once asked by a journalist, the journalist says, like, "Why are you," the Jesuits right now said, "Well, why are you all talking about social justice? Justice, justice, justice." Said, you know, for centuries we had great saints. They never talked about social justice. Teresa of Lisieux never talked about social justice. John of the Cross never talked about social justice. They have an interesting answer. Arupe said, "Because today we know more." And he didn't mean that we're smarter. He didn't say, no, we're smart. He said, we know more. He said, today we know how systems work. And we do. And what he meant by that is this. You know, when you go to Starbucks and have a cup of coffee, they can trace back exactly who got what. The farmer who grew this in Kenya, and he got maybe 15 cents for a kilo, you know, and then who are all the middle people, and you're paying $3.50 at Starbucks. See, they can trace it all out. Today, we have all the information. We know all the systems work. So we also know who's getting shafted, you know, who's getting stepped on, you know. And with coffee, and I use that as an example, the Oblate Mission in Kenya, they grow coffee, and some of the best coffee in the world. You drink it at Starbucks, they get 35 cents for a kilo. That's 2 pounds of roasted coffee. That's what they get for growing it. Now, there's a lot of people making a lot of money off these farmers by the time we get to drink Starbucks down here in San Antonio, you know. See, but today we trace that all out. We know all of this stuff. we know exactly how systems work. They audit people's taxes. We see it, and we see how systems oftentimes are really unfair to the poor. The coffee you drink at Starbucks, the poor are producing the coffee, but they're not getting any of the money. I still like Starbucks coffee, and I go there, but at least I know that I should feel a little guilty when I drink this coffee. But they charge you so much so you don't feel guilty at all. Okay. One of our oblates said you can have a Starbucks experience at home. He said, just make yourself a cup of coffee, drink it, and burn a $10 bill. And, okay, Dorothy Day, and you're familiar, she's going to be the first native-born American saint. And she has probably been the major architect in terms of educating the American mind. We had a major seminar on here a couple of years ago and so on. And she started Catholic Worker. We still have a powerful Catholic worker here in the city and so on. Then Huldah Camaro was one of the bishops, the original liberation theologians. Cesar Chavez, the famous farm worker, organizer. Then Gustavo Gutierrez, who's the father of liberation theology, grew up in Brazil, became a diocesan priest in Brazil, and then at a certain point his own bishop put the kibosh on liberation theology and really tried to silence him. And so what Gustavo did, he joined the Dominicans, and the American Dominican province. He's teaching at Notre Dame now. And then Jim Wallace. Jim Wallace was the son of an evangelical minister in Detroit City. Okay. And during the riots, he was like in 1967. Incidentally, if you want a powerful jolt, go and see the movie called Detroit. It's on Black Lives Matter, but it's done by Catherine Bigelow and so on. And give yourself a couple of hours afterwards to debrief. It's a true story. They use real names and everything. Very, very powerful story. But it was during those riots in Detroit and so on. And he belonged to a white church that his father was running. But he began to sense some of the injustice and so on. He split off, and he's founded something in Washington he's been running now for 40 years called Sojourners. And so today he has mentored most of us. And, my mentoring in social justice has come mostly more recently by reading Dorothy Day and so on, but basically from Jim Wallace and so on. And he's worked for 40 years, oftentimes in very lonely situations without support. He's had a couple of communities that they left him, and him and his wife stayed, and they just kept working. And today they do a number of things. So they run not a soup kitchen, but food for the poor. Their most successful programs actually have been literacy programs. Instead of all in 40 years, feels the most good they've done is tutoring poor kids, after school hours. So they do in Washington, D.C. They have learning centers, and they go to schools, rough public schools. They pick up these young grade schoolers and middle schoolers, high schoolers, and they bring them to centers, and they give them juice and cookies and feed them a little bit, and then tutor them for 2 or 3 hours and then drive them home. And these kids get to go to college, and they break the cycle of poverty, But for a couple of years, he did something very interesting. He would go into inner cities, different cities, and he would get together the church leaders, because in the inner cities, particularly the black churches and so on, they can go where the police can't go. So he'd get together the church leaders, and he'd get together the gang leaders. So you know who's important in the inner city? It's the churches and the gangs. They control that. And then he'd get together the business people. So he tried to make covenants between the gangs, the churches, and the business leaders. And they had some great successes, And he tells a story. He said in Spokane, Washington, they were doing this. He said, and one of the business leaders, he was really impressed. Good Christian man, and he was really taken. And finally, he says to this gang leader, he says, God, he said, I really want to help you. He said, he pulled out his checkbook. He said, I'll write you a check. And the gang leader said, sir, put your money away. He said, if we want your money, we'll steal it from you. He said, but we need you to make some jobs. We don't want your money. We need you to create some jobs here. He said, that's going to transform it. But I love his line. He says, your money we can steal. Other ways of getting that. But Wallace has been kind of the most popular mentor. Now, Pope Francis is very, very strong on social justice. He's the first pope who wrote an encyclical on ecology, Laudato Si. And then the next line, a lot of people don't think of John Paul, but John Paul, even more so than Francis, John Paul was the most radical social justice pope we've ever had. Except people don't read him on that. But so many of the principles I want to give you next week on labor and so on, it come from John Paul, and the Catholic social tradition. So that, John Paul was conservative on women and on liberation theology, but outside of that, he may have been the most liberal pope we've ever had. He was a complex man, but most of the time people just judge his stance on women and on liberation theology, but his encyclicals are far-reaching. And then Daniel Berrigan. Daniel Berrigan died a year ago, and we had a major institute on him here. And I'll talk a lot about Daniel Berrigan the third week. He was truly one of the prophets we've produced. And I'll give you some of his best lines and his work and so on. And he was the real goods. Okay. Then Brian Hare. You probably won't recognize that name. It's not a famous name. Brian Hare is a Roman Catholic priest who's head of the theology department at Harvard. But he's probably the best academic articulator of social justice principle, of anybody. So he's not like the others. They're people on the street. They're famous or something. But if you want somebody who simply articulates things at a high intellectual level with incredible balance and kind of shows where the compass should be, it's Brian Hare. And at least the last I heard, he was still at Harvard. He's the first Roman Catholic to ever have the chair or the chair of the department at Harvard. Brian Stevenson is a young black lawyer working in Atlanta. And he's working mostly to do with the prison system. I read his books, Just Mercy and so on. Very, very powerful. And his work is primarily with prisons and injustices within the prison system and so on. Some Protestant names. William Stringfellow was a Protestant scripture scholar who died a few years ago. Was a friend of the Berrigans, was never arrested, but he was one of the people who were kind of mentored Dorothy Day, the Berrigans, and so on. And then Bishop Tutu, you'll recognize the name. He was one of the major people who helped bring down apartheid in South Africa. You've seen him on television. He's very famous, very dynamic. They tell a great story. They said when, and actually the Oblates knew him very well in South Africa. And so Tutu says, when at the height of apartheid, and the military and the government were getting very, very upset with the churches. So whenever he'd preach, he'd start a Sunday homily, and the soldiers would march down the two sides with their machine guns. That was to intimidate him. And they said, Tutu would smile at them and he'd say, "Welcome." He said, "I'm glad you came to join the winning side." He said, "We've already won." And they laughed at him, but he was right. And he wasn't talking about apartheid. He says, the resurrection. William Stringfellow was once a story to tell about him. Jim Wallace tells the story. He says when he was a young man, they once went to try to stop the movement of some nuclear weapons in New Mexico. And they knew where the train was coming, and they were going to lay their bodies on the track and just stop this nuclear weapon. But two things happened. One of them is the government found out and rerouted the train, so they were at the wrong place, And this is at midnight. The other thing is God arranged the snowstorm. And he said we weren't dressed for it. We're out there and we're freezing to death. We're getting hypothermia, and find out it's the wrong place. Said so they came in the morning. He said, and we were huddled in a church basement. He said, drinking bad coffee from styrofoam cups, thawing out, and said, and lamenting, how terrible this went. He said, and in came William Stringfellow, who was already dying of cancer. Stringfellow says, he said, you're young people. He said, and I'm old, so I can scold you. He said, you're depressed. He said, you shouldn't be. He said, you're depressed because a little project failed? He said, you need to live in hope. He said, you don't have to save the world. He said, the world is already saved. That's what we celebrate Easter time. He said, you only have to live in fact of the faith that you believe it. You know, when we sing Easter songs, Jesus has saved the world. You and I don't have to save the world. We only have to live in the face of the fact that we believe it. He said, you know, whenever a project fails here, that's not important. The resurrection actually succeeded. And that's the big one, you know. But Tutu, you know, he was a resurrection figure. Then Alan Bozak, who some of you met. Remember, we gave him an honorary doctorate from this podium here about 3-4 years ago. He's a South African, and he worked with Archbishop Tutu and also Dennis Hurley and Nelson Mandela. He was one of the 4 or 5 singular figures to bring down apartheid. You know, he told an incredible story when he was here. Bozak said, when he was talking to the faculty, he said when they first started going against apartheid, there wasn't a lot of support. He said, but what we had was the world media. He said, so that they don't like shooting people when all the world television cameras are on. So they were going to march across the bridge as a show of, you know, solidarity and against apartheid. And the government had warned them if they crossed this bridge, they're going to be shot to death. And they had shot some people to death in Soweto, even in the Oblate parish. He said, so they wanted to get a few thousand people. You know, they said, if you get a few thousand people, they're not going to shoot us. He said, but it was a Saturday morning, when they got to start marching, there were 19 people, not a few thousand. He said, and we walked. He said, and we carried Bibles. He said, we all carried a Bible. He said, that's the Christian weapon. He said, soldiers have guns. He said, Christians said, we carry Bibles. He said, and we began walking across this bridge, and he said, it was on world television, so he said, that was our one consolation. Are they really going to shoot us with the whole world watching? He said, and on the other side, he said, there were soldiers, there were helicopters overhead, there were dogs, there were military, these bullhorns, and they kept saying, if you do another step, we'll shoot you, don't do another step. He said, and we were scared. He said, we walked across the bridge, and he said, I looked into the eyes of the people, the soldiers. He said, you know something? He said, they were more scared than we were. He said, but they were scared for a different reason. He said, they realized that if we crossed this bridge, apartheid is over. He said, we were scared for our lives. He said, they were scared for a different reason, but they were more afraid than we were. But he was one of the 19, and he was one of the front 5, carrying a Bible, walking into machine guns, to bring down a system. Apartheid was a system, okay? Then Dennis Hurley, whom the Oblates are very proud of. Dennis Hurley was an Oblate. He was the Bishop of Durban. And he was one of the 4 or 5 major people who helped bring down apartheid in South Africa. Died just a few years ago. And the next one is also an Oblate, Larry Rosebow, whom I mentioned. Larry Rosebow was in prison here twice for anti-war things with the Barragans. Then he went to Brazil, and he was imprisoned there and tortured. And then he got hepatitis, and we flew him back, and he healed, and then he stayed in our mother house for a while, and actually wrote a wonderful book on his experience. It's in our library called Through Weakness to Strength, and so on. And then he went back to Guatemala, and he was eventually shot to death, you know. But Larry social justice was his thing. It's interesting, he was also, though some of you knew him, he had to be the most gentle spirit I've ever met. Here's this guy, you know, he gets in the face of the law and so on, but you know, there wasn't a ungentle bone in his body or in his attitude or anywhere. And he'd been schooled by the Barragans. And I'll talk about that the third week, but he, for instance, said when they did actions, and their actions were always nonviolent, so they would go in, they'd burn draft cards, and he said that was a symbolic action because at the time, and they would pour napalm on draft files and burn them. He said because that's the time we were bombing North Vietnam, and we were napalming people, and people were getting burned to death. He said so we were trying to burn draft files, but he said this is what we do. He said the night before we did the action, he said, we would stay up the whole night and we'd pray the entire night. He said in the morning, he said, then we'd say Mass. He said, and from the Eucharist, we would walk to the place and burned the draft files. He says, and during the night, he said, we all made a vow to each other. He said, and Berrigan will always say, Larry, if you can't do this without being angry, without hating the people who are going to arrest you, then don't do it. Don't do it. He said, the world doesn't need another angry person. He said, if you can't do this without loving the people who are going to arrest you, then don't do it. He said, and we do the Eucharist. He said, and from the Eucharist, we would walk to the place. And now it's interesting, Daniel's brother, Philip, who also went to prison, Philip didn't always do it that way. Philip sometimes got violent at these places and so on, and pushed people and so on. But Larry was just the most gentle man you ever met. And he said the biggest pain of his whole life was that his parents didn't understand it. He said, his parents, he said, my mom and dad wanted a priest with French cuffs who ran a big parish and, who was respected by everybody. And he said, here I'm this bearded guy in prison in different countries and so on, wearing blue jeans without a home. And he said, I suffered a lot because my mom and dad said they just couldn't understand this kind of priest. They wanted a Monsignor, French cuffs, who commands respect in the chancery office and so on. And that was his biggest. Then Dorothy Stang, she's the nun who got with the Amazon, tried to save the Amazon forest. And then John Deere, whom we had here. John Deere spoke from this podium in March, and he had just got out of prison for the 27th time. And he didn't know he was going to make it, but he made it here, got out of prison. Then Jim Forrest. Jim Forrest lived for years with Dorothy Day and has probably done some of the best writing on Dorothy Day. And then these last three, because, feminism is a social justice thing, Christian feminism. And these were the three major American names, who are probably the three biggest names in it. And that's Sandra Schneiders, who often teaches here, spoken for this poem, Elizabeth Johnson, who's at Fordham, and then Joan Chittister, who stays out of sight lest some bishop try to kill her. Okay. And but they're all major justice figures. When you look at and you graph out Christian spirituality, I always say there are 4 non-negotiable pillars to Christian spirituality. They constitute the foundation of Christian spirituality. Okay, now, what are they? We'll take them one at a time. Private prayer and private morality, and that includes charity. See, so that, Jesus makes this pretty clear. Jesus says, if anyone loves me, they will keep my word. See, so private morality, private prayer, private charity, that's not a negotiable thing, And sometimes, we can delude ourselves that justice alone is enough. I remember a young man I worked with when I was in grad school in San Francisco, and I was living at a youth hostel and helping there. I need help out sometimes. Very dedicated young man, but his Christian morality wasn't always, what his mother would have approved of, But he used to tell me, he says, you think that God really cares, whether you, break the 6th commandment or whether you say your morning prayers or go to church or whatever. You think God gives a care about that? I'd say he couldn't care. These are big things. We're trying to save the planet, and you're worried about whether you go to church. I said, think God cares about little things? Yes, God does. God cares about everything. With God, it's little things and big things. So Scripture is pretty clear, Christian discipleship starts with private prayer and private morality. But secondly, it also commands us to justice for the poor. I'm going to give you some numbers here, and they might startle you. If you go into the New Testament and you would simply take every time the poor are mentioned, you would find that it's every 10th line of the entire New Testament. And in the Gospels, in Luke's Gospel, every 6th line in Luke's Gospel would have to do with the poor. In the Epistle of St. James, it's every 5th line. And what Jim Wallace sometimes does in retreats, he gives people a cheap Bible and a razor blade. Said, I want you to go through the Bible during the weekend and cut out every reference to the poor. You know what happens? The whole thing falls apart. It doesn't hold together. So that's symbolic. It's a metaphor. But if you take the poor out of the Scripture, it doesn't hold together. Mr. Wallace says, any gospel that isn't good news for the poor is not the gospel of Jesus. It's his first opening statement. I've come to bring good news to the poor. Now, part of that is also justice. In Canada, we have a program called Cross Country Checkup, And so every Sunday, actually, it's one of the great radio programs we have, and so that they take a topic, and for 2 hours, people phone in from around the country, And so one Sunday I was driving, and they had the program, the question of churches, and just kind of that tension between justice and charity, And the man they had, they always have a couple of people in the studio, and one of them was Archbishop Remy de Roux, from Victoria, who had been he's retired now, he's probably 90, but who has been a great figure of social justice in Canada, kind of our Bishop Hurley. So some lady phoned in, and she said to him, she says, she said, our priest, she said, I'm a Catholic. She said, you're a Catholic. She said, our priest, he's always talking about social justice, social justice, social justice. And she said, isn't that just something that the liberation theologians invented, And now they're trying to foist it on us. She said, why justice, 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 And so Remy de Roux said, well, what would you say if you had a priest who said, private morality and the sixth commandment and prayer, that's just something that the nuns invented, and they're trying to push onto the whole church. She said, well, I would have the priest suspend it, So de Roux said, well, you should have the priest suspended too if he won't preach about social justice. They're both non-negotiable in Scripture. Jesus calls us to charity, and Jesus calls us to justice, And again, I said, a lot of people do one or the other, So I know some people are pretty just, but they're not very charitable. I know some people who are truly charitable. They are wonderful people, give you the shirt off their back, but they won't look at systems, See, that's a gap in our discipleship. But then, not only that, it's charity, and then justice, but then also a commitment inside of an ecclesial community. This hasn't got to do with what we're talking about tonight, but it's a prong of discipleship. And that is Christianity. Let me put it to you this way. Christianity is not something you do alone. Christianity is a religion you do with other people. It's interesting. You can, if you study world religions, Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, Islam to a point, and so on, you can do them alone. You can be a good Buddhist alone. You can't be a good Christian or even a good Jew alone. Judaism and Christianity, by essence, they're religions we do together. We're called to come to God in a group, which is frustrating. If you go on a tour, it's so nice to go by yourself. You can eat when you want, stay where you want, stop where you want. When you're on a group outing, it is a pain, But as Christians, we're here on a group outing, We're called to come to God in a community, So Christianity is constitutively communitarian. That's why when someone says, I'm spiritual but not religious, that can be very true, but it can't be true for a Christian. You can be a good spiritual person, but if you're a Christian, Christianity by essence demands some type of communitarian church involvement. So you can't be a good Christian and not, however you define church. But you have to have some kind of ecclesial community that you journey with. Otherwise, we're not Christian. In fact, today a lot of people worry about heresy. I think that the biggest heresy in Christianity today is what I call a viral heresy. So it's not a dogmatic heresy, a viral heresy. This virus that somehow we don't have to do it together. And that's partly predicated in Western society where, the reason why we struggle so much with community in church is because we struggle so much with community, period. It's true for society. Neighbors don't know each other anymore. Neighbors don't care about each other. We don't have neighborhoods, so we don't have parishes either. People, today we want to have church and community on our own terms. Reginald Bibby, who's a wonderful sociologist of religion, a Baptist in Canada, but he's our major tracker of religion for 40 years. And Bibby has this soundbite. He says, people are treating their churches in exact same ways as they're treating their families, which means they want them around, but not much. See, your kids, they don't want you to disappear or die, but they don't want you interfering with their life very much. They'll call you when they want you. And that's why so few people go to church regularly. They don't want their churches to disappear. You know, have the church there. When we need it, we'll call you, you know. But see, that's a societal problem. We're adult children of René Descartes. You know, remember René Descartes says, I think, therefore I am. Descartes said, what's the only thing you can be sure that's real? He's right. It's you, because you're inside of you. You're real. Your headaches are real. Your heartaches are real. Your issues are real. And you may be dreaming everything else. Okay? That's new in history, you know. And it's also not true in a lot of other cultures. But, you know, we're radically individualistic in Western society, which brings many benefits. We have all this great freedom and so on. But we really struggle with community, family, and stuff at every level. We struggle with church. But Christianity, you can't, if you're a Christian, you can't say, I'm spiritual but not religious. No. You got to be spiritual and religious. Christianity, community comes with the package. Okay. And then the last one, you know, if somebody were a person of wonderful private prayer, charity, private morality, social justice, goes to church, what's still missing? A very important part. A mellow and gracious heart. Because, as T.S. Eliot, remember T.S. Eliot, great poet. In English, probably the best religious poet of the last century. And T.S. Eliot says, the last temptation that's the greatest treason is to do the right thing for the wrong reason. So I'll give you an example. The older brother of the prodigal son, notice what he says to his father. I stayed home. I've been completely faithful. I've never left you. I've done all the work. But notice he can't go into his father's house. The father's house is heaven. He's standing outside the gates of heaven because he's bitter. He's angry. Notice he's done everything right, but his energy is all wrong. See, we can do everything right and have all the wrong energy, and we're not there. So, and it's interesting. I was first alerted to this by the liberation theologians. Gustavo Gutierrez was the first person I ever heard that from. And then Thomas Merton. They'd say, it's not enough just to have your life right. You have to have your heart right. And the heart has to be right with Jesus. It's got to be mellow and gracious. You know, I want to tell you a great story on this. And I ended up in the Holy Longing. But in 1985, and I was still a young theologian, just starting at that time, and I went to Belgium in the summer for a conference on world church. And this conference was organized by Christiane Brusselmans. And many of you remember that name. She's the woman who almost single-handedly revised the RCIA and the church. She's a wonderful, gracious theologian. But anyway, she set together this institute on a world church. And she brought together 40 people from all over the world, from every continent, and they were divided into groups. So at every continent had a group of about 8 people, you know, and then they would speculate about world church and the poor and poverty and ecclesiology and so on. Now, I wasn't a participant. I was brought there to be a secretary for group 2. So I'm supposed to write up this thing and so on. But in our group 2, very interesting, people from all over the world, and we had a nun from the Philippines, a young nun, and she could have been Mother Teresa's younger sister. I mean, this is a nun you order from a catalog, okay? Okay. She had everything. She was young. She was completely dedicated to the poor, you know. She was a woman of deep prayer, you know, and charity and so on. And she described to the group, like she said, I have a real radical, you know, lifestyle. She said, I don't sleep on a bed. She said, I try to be in solidarity with the poor. So she sleeps on a straw mattress. And, you know, she has a special diet, and everything is to be in this radical solidarity with the poor. And she's a woman of deep prayer. Obviously goes to church, goes to Mass every day. So this is what happened. We were meeting in a retreat center outside of the city of Bruges. The retreat center was it was less palatial than the ORC. it was okay, but it wasn't exactly, we weren't living high off the hog, But also we were working really hard. So Christian Brussels was, the first days we were going sessions morning, afternoon, and evening. And by Thursday, this started Sunday, we were pretty tired. So come Thursday noon, Christiane came in and she rang a bell and she said, "You've all been working too hard. So this afternoon," she said, "we're going to have congé," in French. That's it, just free time. This is going to be celebration, fiesta, you'd say here, So she said, "You have about half an hour. Go to your rooms, put on blue jeans and running shoes and get some straw hats. And we're going to take a bus. We're going to take you into Bruges, which is the Venice of the North. It's beautiful, beautiful city." Said, "And we want you to spend the afternoon just drinking and shopping and enjoying yourself." Said, "Then at 7 o'clock, we'll meet in the Holiday Inn, and we're going to have an exquisite meal because you deserve it." Well, it was the biggest crisis for the whole thing, Some people said, "Well, this is an insult to the poor. We're here to talk about the poor, and we're going to do all this stuff and so on." But we did it, and we went and then we met at the Holiday Inn at 7 o'clock, and it was a wonderful meal for about 3 hours with silver forks and wine and so on. Well, the last day, when we ended with a Eucharist, and at the end they had an open microphone. They said, if you have a conversion experience, just share it with the group. So a lot of people, mostly from the first world, would go up and say, "I had this conversion to see people from other worlds who are struggling with poverty, struggling with their problems. I realized, how pampered and spoiled I am as a Westerner," and so on. But at a certain point, our young Filipina nun went up and took the microphone, and she said, "I also had a conversion experience. In a way I didn't dream I needed ever to be converted." It said it happened with that going to Bruges. She said, "From the second it was announced that I froze up and I was angry. And I thought, this is an insult to the dignity of the poor. And I'm here on the patrimony of the poor, and we're going to dine and go and shopping and so on." She said, "But I believe in community." She said, "So I went along." She said, "I went along to stay with the community." She said, "But I was miserable the whole afternoon." She says, "And a couple of women befriended me, and they kind of dragged me along." She said, "And I had my first drink of gin and tonic ever." And on a terrible thing. She said, "And I went along." She said, "But I was miserable." She said, "And it culminated." She said, "I walked into the Holiday Inn, and I saw the linen napkins and knives and forks." She says, "I nauseated. I literally nauseated." She said, "I couldn't stay there." She said, "I went and I sat on the bus." But she'd sat on the bus for about 3 hours while we ate. She said, "I was sitting in the bus." She said, "I was so angry, and I thought to myself, would Jesus be in there eating and drinking?" She said, "And I had a horrible realization, he would." And he would be thoroughly enjoying himself. She said, "And I realized that John the Baptist would be on the bus with me, eating grasshoppers and saying they're all going to go to hell, She said, "I realized that John all mixed up with Jesus, She said, "I realized there's something not right in my heart yet, Gutierrez always says, he used to say, "If you want to come to Latin America," when he was still living here, "and help us," he said, "if you watch your television set and you get angry, say, this isn't right. We have all this wealth and therefore you want to come." He said, don't come. He said, "We have many problems without importing your neurosis and unhappiness." He said, "Don't come if you're angry." He said, "If you are grateful for what God has done for you," he said, "come, it'll be wonderful." When I was a student in Belgium, I went one Christmas to spend a Christmas in working with Sister Emmanuel. She was the kind of Mother Teresa of Cairo, one with a couple of Canadian philosophy students and so on. She was a marvelous woman. She was a Sister Zion, and she lived in a hut with the garbage collectors, and the people would come and make their living collecting garbage and so on. But a lot of young people from around the world would come and join her to help work there. And she had this rule: as soon as you got angry, she'd send you home. When I was there was a young woman from Winnipeg, and she got all angry and fired up, and Sister Emmanuel sent her home. She said, "No, it's not. You don't need to be here right now. See, like Gutierrez says, you got to do all this stuff, but it's got to come from graciousness. It's got to come from a mellow heart." Daniel Berrigan, if you can't love the people, if you're going to hate the people who arrest you, then don't do it. The world doesn't need another angry person. We got lots of anger out there, You're going to see that's going to be the real burden of prophecy. To do it in love, to do it in charity, to do it with humor and to a mellow, gracious heart. Tell a story of Thomas Merton. They said during the Selma, Alabama march, some young minister came to him and he says, I am so angry and I'm full. He said, I'm just so angry. I want to do something. He said, what should I do? And Merton said, you shouldn't do anything. He said, go have a beer. He said, deal with your anger. He said, and then go and try to help with the poor, you know. Now, that's a little bit too slick. Sometimes, as Jim Wallace says, sometimes we have to act ourselves into a new way of thinking or act ourselves into a new way of feeling, you know, so that, see, sometimes we, you know, which comes first, you know? Sometimes we think something through and then it leads to action, you know. A change of thought leads to action. Sometimes just the action leads to a change of thought. Sometimes we have to act ourselves into a new way of thinking. Or sometimes we have to act ourselves into a new way of feeling, you know. For instance, parents do that sometimes, you know. When you have your first child, you don't know how it's going to affect you. All of a sudden you have a baby, and all of a sudden you think and feel really differently. You didn't think this out. You acted in a certain way, and then it changed the whole way you think. So sometimes serving the poor is a way of getting rid of your anger, you know. So at Merton, that's a little bit too slick. Say, first get unangry, then serve the poor. Sometimes the way you're going to get unangry is by going serving the poor, and so on. So but those four go together. A healthy Christian discipleship, you know, private prayer, private morality, charity, and justice for systems. Some kind of ecclesial commitment. You got to be involved in some kind of church. And then mellowness and graciousness of heart. Otherwise, we can be the older brother, the prodigal son. Notice, he's doing everything right, but it's all wrong. Because his heart is bitter and angry. Okay, we've only got about 8 minutes left. Let me say just a little bit about abortion. So we had questions before. You know, remember I began by saying these are systemic issues. They're system issues. So let's just unpack each one. I'm taking one because it's so central. You know, if I said, what issue is this country the most polarized over? It's the issue of abortion. And abortion here separates not just the sincere from the insincere, the good from the bad. It separates the sincere from the sincere, the good from the good. There are a lot of good people on both sides of this debate. Okay, now, underlying it, there's systemic issues. Let me just name the issues. The first one, it's our present societal sexual ethos. Now, what do I mean by that? Story. Some years ago back home in Quebec, in French Canada, there was a famous thing, and it went to the Supreme Court. And anyway, there was a couple. They were living together, so they had a common law marriage, and she got pregnant. And actually, it was a planned pregnancy. They wanted to have a baby, but then during the pregnancy, they had this huge fallout, and their relationship unraveled, and it was unraveled with great bitterness. So she went and had the baby aborted. Okay, and her idea was, she says, and he went to the Supreme Court to try to stop her from having this abortion, you know. But this is what she said. She says, I wanted the baby while we were together, but now she said, I can't have this baby because for the rest of my life, it's going to remind me of this relationship, and I don't want this. Okay, now notice. Just put this into a larger context, you know. See, we live in a society where men and women sleep together who have no intention of having a long-range relationship. Well, when that happens, you're going to have abortion, pure and simple. It's always there's going to be some abortion because there's a child, we don't want the child, and the child is actually going to be a further bitterness in our relationship. And it happens. See, in any society where you have our sexual ethos, you're going to have abortion, you know, pure and simple. That's the first issue. The second one is economics. You know, they do studies on this. Abortion in this country and the Western world in general is driven more by economics than by anything else. Let me give you a statistic here. And I got in trouble once for publishing this, you know. But for instance, when Clinton was president, he was pro-choice, okay? And when George Bush Jr. was president, he was pro-life and sincerely pro-life. But it's interesting, abortions dropped under Bill Clinton. Why? Because he gave more money to poor people. See, so abortion isn't just driven by liberal ideology or feminists or whatever. It's driven by the economy. A lot of people are just poor. And, they can't afford to have children. And it has to do with health care and with thousands of other things and so on. But one of the driving issues inside of abortion is economics, more so than ideology. And I wrote that in an article. Not this archbishop, but another archbishop called me and he says, "You can't write that." I said, "It's true." He said, "You still can't write it." And actually he made a good enough point. He said that can be misunderstood. I wasn't begrudging him that. But it was just true, See, abortion is often driven by a sexual ethos. It's driven by economics. It's driven by an interrelationship with other life issues, okay? And especially today, it's driven by the radicalization of both sides of this, pro-life and pro-choice. They've done studies, serious studies, and this would be quite a revelation. And they discover this, that if you actually could simply silence all voices on abortion right now in the United States and simply do a survey, you would find that 85% of Americans agree on where we should be, which means that you could have abortion in radical cases, but normally you wouldn't have it and so on. But pro-life and pro-choice have so radicalized and so demonized each other that we cannot even talk about it anymore. But the radicals are about 15% on either side, but they've taken over the complete debate. So for instance, pro-choice, their thing is, you people aren't pro-life, you're pro-birth. You just want a kid born and you don't care what happens to the kid, It's a misnomer, but vice versa, something that pro-life often are stunned to hear, that the vast, vast majority of pro-choice people are not pro-abortion at all. I just know hundreds of women who are pro-choice, they're against abortion. See, to be pro-choice doesn't mean you're for abortion. It says, I don't want somebody in Washington, a man, telling me how to run my life. That's something else. I want to have a child, but I don't want, men in Congress and stuff, whatever, or judges telling me how to run my life. But that comes as a surprise to most people, that the vast majority of pro-choice, now about 15% of pro-choice people are pro-abortion. And you get people say, I remember one of these movie stars says, it's like having your hair done. What's the big deal? But that's not where the vast majority of pro-choice men and women are at. They're against abortion, but they're for pro-choice, and vice versa. Most pro-life people are truly pro-life, but the image that pro-life often projects is not pro-life at all. In fact, today, some analysts, they say, we shouldn't work with 2 categories, we should work with 4 categories. We should talk about people who are pro-birth, pro-life, and then pro-choice and pro-abortion. So that it's helpful to have 4 categories. Some people, they're pro-birth, but they're not pro-life. Some people are pro-life. Some people are pro-choice, but they're not for abortion, and other people are pro-abortion. But see, that whole thing is broken down, again, because our whole system of communicating and everything else, our whole media and so on, makes it impossible for us to have that conversation. And so that it's based on misunderstandings. So we have a whole system in our society. And the other one I didn't mention here is also sexism, which is this. Charles Camozzi, whose book below, it's very interesting. He's a young theologian at Fordham, and he did a long study on this, and he also shows that in a good number of abortions that women have, they're driven there by men, by their fathers, by their husbands, by their economic situation, by the man who got them pregnant, whatever, that oftentimes the pressure is still coming from the male side, to have the abortion and so on. See, so that's also in a culture where we're still pretty sexist in many ways. To our credit, we're better than a lot of other parts of the world, but we're not there, See, so if you put our sexual ethos, sexism, the economy, where the debates are at and so on, in a society like ours, you're going to have abortion, okay? Now, the legal fight, and that's something else, and so on, and pro-life, and Roe versus Wade and Supreme Courts, doesn't rule out what needs to happen there, but it's not going to stop abortion. Abortion will stop, again, when we drain the swamp. Abortion will stop when abortion clinics are open and nobody goes. Then it's over. See, so again, these things, they're battles of the heart, but they're battles to change a system. We have to change the way we understand sexuality. We have to change the way, we treat the poor and what it means to have a child and a woman to be isolated and so on. See, most women have abortions. Again, most, not all. Abortion sometimes is a pretty calculated and substitute for birth control. That's something else. But a good number of abortions are a woman who in our society finds herself really isolated, without the proper support, with all the wrong pressures, caught in our sexual ethos and so on. In an economy that's not going to support her, she's going to have an abortion. See, it's a private thing, but it's also a systemic thing. It's a system, And so in the Western world, we live in a system, not just the United States, it's Western Europe all over and so on. We live in a system where in this kind of society, because of all these factors, you're going to have abortion. See, so to stop abortion, it's not just enough to change the law. We have to change systems. First of all, we have to start teaching our kids a different sexual ethos. Right now, and I know I may sound like an old, die-in-the-heart celibate, but the sexual ethos in our culture scares me. It scares me, because we don't have much of an ethos anymore. That we've just in the last generation, we've gone from, sex as an extension of dating to sex as hookup sex, which is no longer even an extension of dating. So we read authors like Donna Freitas and stuff who do this, who study this, and it's frightening, And, I was invited to give a talk at Boston College in March, and Tom Groom got me to come. He says, "Now I want you to come, and I want you to talk about chastity, but don't mention the word." He said, "But until you're about 45 minutes into the talk," he said, "first of all, if you put it in the title, nobody will come." Now, Boston College is a Catholic university. He said, "We estimate that 1 of every 6 of our students is in some kind of depression or in some counseling right now, which has to do with their sexuality." 1 out of 6. It's Boston College. We're not in a good place. See, so that's a system. It's not those kids. It's us. It's the way our society understands sex.